Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. My name is Omri Johnson, your host. I hope you're well. Join me as we continue to deconstruct the shortcomings of traditional DEI strategies and co-create a vision for more transformative, human-centered approaches to inclusion. Myself and my esteemed guests will challenge the status quo, dive deep into the reactive, supplemental nature of many DEI initiatives. We'll explore how to reclaim the profound and transformational potential of inclusion as a catalyst for collective growth, empowerment, and organizational change. Season 2 of the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast starts now. Hey folks, I hope you're well. I wanted to share a little bit ahead of Dr. Sheena Mason's podcast. I don't generally do this because generally podcasts stand on their own, and this one does as well. But in this case, this body of work that started with my interview with David and Sabrina Smith a couple of years ago, and now with Sheena Mason, also a race abolitionist, has shifted me. And it's not shifted in the way that I was a big proponent of focusing on race before, but the conversation about racelessness, the conversation about race abolitionism, the combination about changing the language that we use for racialization and race/ism, as Dr. Mason frames it, has shifted the way I think about this, and particularly in my work in inclusion. I think we should be teaching about race, but we should not be teaching about race separate from racism, and we should not be teaching about race as something that we need to continue to embrace. So what I mean by that is we can shift a whole conversation and generations to follow in this conversation about race in ways that I don't think we had the access to in the way that we do today, given these scholars. And it's not an easy path for them. In fact, I recently saw an interview with Dr. David Livingstone Smith talking about he and his wife Sabrina's book that they're trying to get published about race abolitionism. People don't want to touch it, but it might be, in fact, one of the most profound ways forward in the work of organizations, in the work of societies that we've ever had. And when we talk about it in a comprehensive way, we can do something about it similar to the way that we need to talk about anti-Semitism, which falls into that category, which we're starting to do more, but we're not doing it with the goal of understanding. We're doing it with the goal of being right. So that's the distinction. This was a profound interview for me. The book is absolutely amazing. I recommend it to all. Here are a few reasons why, from quotes toward the end of Dr. Mason's book. I think it's important, and I'll close with these quotes, if I may, before we go into the episode. Toward the end of the book, a few quotes that came up from Dr. Mason. Love for ourselves and each other, Ubuntu, can pave the way toward greater forward progress and success, whereas racialist ideology precludes many of us from loving freely or willingly. The togetherness wayfinder, which is a central construct in her book, the togetherness wayfinder or raceless anti-racism removes those unnecessary barriers. If you open your mind and heart to the possibility of being wrong about racism, you gain infinitely more than you think. You gain insight about yourself and people you're taught to presume are distinct and different from you in ways they aren't. You finally start to see actual differences and similarities, mind you. That's my addition. You finally start to see actual differences more clearly. Then lastly, you stop holding on to your self-proclaimed moral high ground because you realize more of what you didn't know and would have never known had you stuck firmly to your side of racialist thinking. You learn to love and to be grounded within yourself more so that you help your inner child stop mourning what they didn't but should have received. As a result, you learn to love other people more and have grounded understandings of who and how each person is, a happening that only comes with knowing a person or being able to speak fluently from positions that aren't yours. That starts with understanding yourself. You come to understand everything, including yourself, which leads to so much more growth and freedom. You stop racializing and erasing humans in the face of racism and its attending ideology. We have to give that constellation, maternal energy, and love to ourselves and each other. Our future is limitless. This is worth a conversation. I welcome it. It's not one that many who entered into the fray of DEI through anti-racism have had. The depth, the honesty, the experiential nature of it. And I'm not just talking for those who are racialized as Black. I'm talking for all people who are racialized and all of us who racialize each other. We can start a new conversation that I never quite honestly imagined what was possible. And as having a 6-year-old who's racialized in ways that I wasn't growing up, I am very much hopeful for the future. That is, if we can move into this new paradigm that's about racelessness. Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. This is Omri Johnson, your host. I'm here with Dr. Sheena Mason. Now, I'm going to get into Sheena, but I just told her I finally finished reading her book, which we're going to talk about a lot. And I'm telling you, folks, if you haven't read The Raceless, and I said raceless, so hear me out. The Raceless Anti-Racist. You should. It's a breakthrough book, and I am hard on books. It's a breakthrough text, one that I think if you're interested in anti-Black or any other kind of racism being eradicated ever, this is a language, this is an approach, this is a way of thinking that I think we all need to get behind. And I'm finding myself even using the language and being uncomfortable saying old language because she's introduced a vocabulary that's quite profound. So I'm excited to jump in. Sheena, welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Fantastic. So we always start off with a couple questions. And I was telling Sheena, y'all, that I sent her all these questions like I was trying to get in and trying to prove her like she didn't know what she was talking about. I was trying to be a little provocative. And then I read the book. I was like, she's gone way deeper than I had ever gone in this conversation. So now we're going to talk specifically about the book and about how Sheena has brought this together because it's really powerful. But we'll start with our first question. Sheena, a favorite song or movie that you go to over and over again?
Okay, I love all of the Harry Potter films. And as a huge book person, obviously, I haven't read a single Harry Potter book. The films are my go to, and I worry that the books will ruin it for me.
I think I've only read one, so it didn't ruin it for me, but it had me questioning, like I do with the Tolkien movies. Like, oh, why did they leave that out? Like, where are the Entwives? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so I get it. You don't need to read them, just watch the films. And then you have so many really powerful literary references in your book. But what's one book or one person that's influenced you or inspired you personally or professionally in your life or career journey?
I oscillate between Elaine Locke and Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison is definitely at the top of the list in terms of contemporary thinkers. And Elaine Locke, 100 years ago, was talking about race in very familiar ways. I find myself discovering just how ahead of his time he was with everything I read and reread. I have a deep appreciation for Alain Locke. A lot of people know Toni Morrison. More people need to know Locke.
I can't agree more. As a English major at Morehouse, a lot of Locke's work is still in my consciousness, and reading your book brought a lot of it back to the fore. So thank you for that. So, Sheena, let's give the audience a little bit about, as much as we can before we jump into conversation about the book, who you are and what are you seeking to create in the world?
Whew. I'm seeking to create imagination where it lacks and pathways to better futures for all of us. That is my life's purpose. That is my God given work. And that's what I'm committed to. And that's how the book came into being. How I got here is a long story, of course, but the short answer is I experienced a lot of turmoil and trauma as a child. I turned to education, music, sports as outlets and really as the only safe spaces that I had. Literature in particular exposed me to worlds that I was not experiencing. It exposed me to possibility. And I clung to that as a child who didn't have a lot of reasons to believe there was more to life than what I was experiencing.
Mm.
And when I found myself an undergraduate, initially I thought I would pursue psychology, get a advanced degree in psychology and work with young people in similar circumstances that I had experienced and overcome. But I found the pull of literature to be undeniable, and literary studies offered me all of the thirst for imagination and creativity, and also practical application of imagination, which I think sometimes we tend to think about as polar opposites. I found all of that through my study of literature, particularly African American literature, and I've been unstoppable ever since.
Unstoppable is a good word. And that brings me to what I'm excited to talk about is your book, your text. My colleague, Jonathan Ashong Lamptey, always has the physical book, but I don't always get physical books living here in Switzerland. So I end up with them on Kindle. Tell us the big three ideas from the racist, anti-racist, why ending race is the future of anti-racism. What are the 3 to 5 most important ideas from the book for our audience?
The central conclusion is that to end racism, we have to end our belief in and practice of what we call race. And how I arrived at that conclusion is in my study of race across time, across human history, and by extension, everything to do with racism, I came to recognize that the fiction of race is the dehumanizing apparatus that gets attached to human beings that then allows us to be broken into false hierarchies. And in that way, it's a thoroughly pernicious category and a thoroughly pernicious practice, right? Because it's important to note that though it is a belief and it's reflective of a belief system, it goes beyond our brains, beyond our minds, beyond our hearts, even. It's something that we literally practice. And so, with those two central points in mind, I offer language in terms of okay, well, if that's the case, how can we stop naturalizing the category, reinforcing the category and practice of race, thereby the practice of racism? What ideas, what philosophies must we hold in order to achieve that same objective? What are the central rules that can be our guiding forces to this North Star of abolishing racism?
That's a good summary of a lot of what I took from it. But I want to circle in and kind of key in on the language because I find myself even now really having a hard time saying the word race, even saying the word black, saying anything that's racialized. It's really changed my ability to discuss it, but I know other people might not are not necessarily there yet. So it feels like I'm like in a choppy microphone, like up about the topic. Talk about the language you're using and why. It's almost like you're talking about it like it's a historical artifact already as I'm reading the book. It's like you're talking about racism, like you use this race slash ism word a lot. Tell us about that process, because that's a really different way for people to think about that or within language.
Yes, it's a bit paradoxical because I hear people talking about, oh, that's rhetorical or that's semantics, not in relation to my work, but just in relation to arguments people have made about language. But what I've come to appreciate is that our language reflects our ideologies, right? It reflects, reinforces, maintains, creates all of the things. And ideologies have material impacts and material consequences, material benefits. So when it comes to the problem of race slash ism, which is how we might articulate the written form of my word, I was thinking, how is it that our current articulation of the problems of race, our current articulation of something cultural, ethnic, national, economic, or social class, how is it that our continued use of race language in a very uncomplicated and also not obvious way, how can we overcome some of what's happening there, some of that reinforcement of race slash ism by using language like a white person, a black person, a mixed person, a biracial person, etc., in everyday conversation, not just academic or educational. So, what I'm offering folks is language like a person who gets racialized as fill in the blank, a person who gets racialized as black, or a person who got racialized as white, if we're talking about historical instance. And in that shift, the idea is I'm centering the human, right? I'm recentering the human, a person, right? A human who gets racialized as. I'm highlighting the external factors that exist in a particular context or in a particular time that dictates that this person is fill in the blank race. Because race, modern scientists agree, is not a biological reality. It is not a biological fact about the human species. So, in refusing to use the shorthand, a black person, I'm recentering the human, which is something that race itself and the language of race cannot do. It has the opposite effect. And I'm showing that there's an external something happening in relation to the person. Similarly, when I say race slash ism, the reason why I changed it from the plain Jane racism, right, a word that already exists, is to highlight the fact that race is a component of the system of racism in and of itself. And we cannot skip to the good part, though many people make a case for it, right? A lot of people who espouse color blindness are desiring to skip to the good part. Morgan Freeman has that viral clip. You stop calling me a black man, I'll stop calling you a white man. That's not what this is. This is a bridge to get to the good part. This is a necessary bridge to get to the good part. This is how we can talk about racism from a historical lens. This is how we can talk about it from a contemporary. And perhaps as importantly to my mind, this is how we can create a future without it. This framework, the Wayfinder, is a bridge for us to get to that place. Part of the bridging, too, requires us to translate race language in a way that we're currently not doing, or when we're trying to do that, we're still using the language of race, so we're falling short, misunderstanding each other, or feeling antagonistically toward each other. If we imagine race is a villain in an episode of Scooby Doo, right? What happens at the end of every Scooby Doo episode? Do you know this, Omri?
I do, but I want to hear it from you.
The villain gets demasked. So we imagine we're chasing race. Race is like the literal black and white colors split down the middle. Race is even written on their forehead. We catch race, we demask the villain, and then race shapeshifts into these five different forms: culture, ethnicity, social class, economic class, and racism itself. In our ability to translate what any of us means when we're using race language and talking about race into any of those five constructions, that's also part of the necessary work that has to happen to not just open up our imaginations, but also open up pathways to creating a better future for all. Sometimes we're using race language and we're talking about culture, and
Mm.
for more people to recognize that, hey, if we abolish race slash ism, that's not the same as abolishing culture, right? That's not even part of the conversation at all. And in fact, what I present in The Racist Anti-Racist is a much more liberated, and I would argue truer vision of what culture and cultural formation actually is, right?
No, I
We're
want to come back because this is not easy for people, particularly because some people, and this is where I'll get into a little controversy because I'm going to move into something. There's two things here. The first one is this is a little bit of a contemporary dynamic because you talk about creolization, and we have a new pope in the Catholic Church. I don't know if you're Catholic or not, but the creolization that you talk about in the book, and the pope is Creole. But then I saw people online making the pope black. And I asked the question, which nobody answered when I would go into people's streams, why does it matter that we want to racialize the pope? Like, why would you do that? And why does it matter what color, what so-called race? And I find myself putting that in air quotes. So the Pope is actually Creole. And when I saw that, I thought about you. Like, what does Sheena think about this Creole Pope, given how she frames creolization? Can you share a little bit about if you heard any of that and what it occurs to you to have a Creole Pope? What's that symbol mean to you?
That's a great question, and I've been thinking about it deeply, but I'm not going to pretend to be well versed on the new pope's heritage. But I have seen a lot of the controversy circulating. Not only are people racializing him as black, but other people are racializing him as white.
Mm.
So there's a lot to discuss. And rather than have these kinds of cultural moments and political moments bring us to some kind of epiphany about race slash ism in the first place, it often encourages folks to double down on their positions and their views, which is very unfortunate. But I view Louisiana Creole as something different from creolization. So I want to make that demarcation here.
Mhm.
Creolization, as I think of it, more along the lines of Edward Glissant, who I reference in at least one of the chapters. He was a West Indian writer who theorized about hybridization, creolization in the Caribbean. The simplest explanation of creolization to my mind is something along the lines of culture forms in multi-directional ways. And as soon as the Middle Passage happens, that cultural exchange happens and has continued to happen, right, after emancipation, etc. And there's something about the problem of race slash ism that often prevents us from seeing that multi-directional cultural exchange. Too often it's viewed as, well, early modern Europeans forced their culture and their cultural beliefs onto Africans and indigenous peoples. And certainly that happened, right? And Africans and indigenous people also had culture, also maintained culture, and all of it became synchronized, especially when you talk about Catholicism, like the religious syncretism that happened in places like Latin America and the Caribbean, and the creolization or that cultural mixing happened, of course, in the United States. I find the problem of racialization as hindering our willingness to really grapple with the complexity of culture. Instead, we continue to talk about it in black and white ways. And it's never that simple. I'm not the first person to say this. The likes of Albert Murray, Elaine Locke, decades before Murray, Ralph Ellison, plenty of people in the American context have spoken about American culture as not being white, as being mulatto, they called it. Murray was like famous for calling it
Right.
mulatto. And though I contend with that kind of framing, the point remains. We are a mixed nation. We are not the only mixed nation, but we are certainly a mixed nation. The dynamics of cultural formation are not neatly categorized, not neatly put into a box. And the fact that we continue to talk about Americanness in the language of white, though that is what the dominant culture tends to believe and maintain and uphold, that is not the reality. How can we appreciate and be more insightful as it pertains to the reality of these things? That's part of what the language of the Togetherness Wayfinder that I present in the Raceless Anti-Racist book, that is part of what that can bring us to, as much as it is a philosophy of race slash ism, it's also a philosophy of culture that
Sure.
is freed from the constraints of racism.
Sure. Sheena, the way you explained that, it brought me to a few. I have so many passages highlighted. If I just read through them, we'd be out of time. But I'm going to read this one. I work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. As you know, I mostly focus on the notion of inclusion more than anything else without leaving identity behind, but thinking about identity in this more dynamic way, as you just described. You talk about some things that are often unpopular amongst so called Black scholars. You made this statement. I'm going to read it directly. Moreover, examining crime through the lens of anti Black race slash ism doesn't lead to more justice and equality. To the contrary, it perpetuates racist beliefs, behaviors, and policies. It's not often that we inquire about the numbers or read them in a way that does not exaggerate reality and automatically affirm our pre-existing racial slash est beliefs. You talk about the example in 2019 before the pandemic shutdowns of almost 7 million arrests across 11,000 agencies, 3%, three arrests for 100 people for all crimes. The total number of murder and non negligent manslaughter arrests was 7,964. And then you go on and you talk about the racialized breakdown for arrestees was as follows: 4,078 Black, quote unquote, which was 51.2%, 3,650 white, 125 American Indian, and so on. And you see a similar breakdown later as well. And you talk about this. And what I wanted to bring the question to is the belief in focusing on that, that a lot of anti racist kind of DEI practitioners put forward. When you talk about this, you basically say the focus on that is not helping. But that's where a lot of the focus has gone. And I imagine some people don't necessarily like when they hear the way you frame that, because it's, to me, it's very objective and very clear. It's what the data says. I'm a scientist by training. I'm like, great. But somebody else, whenever you come with that data, kind of like what Roland Fryer did with his work, they went after him badly. I hope you never get the treatment that Roland got, but you told the truth. How is that getting in a back and forth with the people that are, I guess I'll call them the anti racists that focus on race, or the DEI people that focus on racialization? How do you square that? The data says one thing, the focus on the things that are racialized are not helping. How do you have that conversation in a way that people can actually do something with?
It's something that I'm still navigating and figuring out myself. Different audiences will receive the same information in different ways. And really, what I hear you asking is a question about the benefit or lack thereof of racializing data. My inclination, based on what I know, is that racializing data is not helpful in almost all contexts. What I get at in that particular chapter that you point out is something along the lines of, because we continue to look through these racializing lens, anti-Black racism is actually, ironically, even in and through a desire to help resist and identify and ostensibly combat anti-Black racism, right? Many Americans believe sincerely that people who get racialized as Black are more inherently violent and criminal. You don't have to look very far on various news outlets and platforms to see constant representation of so-called Black people in this less than inferior, hyper violent way. Yet when you break down the actual numbers, you come to recognize that roughly 3% or less of all people who get racialized as Black in the United States are charged with committing a violent crime. And that includes like all violent crimes. That is a far cry from when I ask a class of students, what percentage of people who get racialized as Black would you make an educated guess for, right, commit violent crimes? Of course, the numbers are astronomical in their minds. And mind you, you focused on, in your question, you focused on so called Black scholars, but I would contend inevitably it is actually progressive or liberal
Mm,
people who get racialized as white who find my perspective and the information I present in the book as something to be more contentious with.
wow.
And students align with that because most of my students are students who get racialized as white, right? They'll guess something like 60% of people who get racialized as Black commit violent crimes. It's always astronomical. You change the question and ask, okay, now what percent of people who get killed by law enforcement are racialized as Black or get racialized as Black? And it's always astronomical, it's through the roof. And when you walk through the actual statistics, they're literally shocked. That's not the narrative that the media, no matter what media they follow and consume, presents to them. That's not the narrative they hear about from their families or their peers. It's just not the picture of racialized Black people in this country. It's just not. And their initial feelings are often ones of anger after they get over the shock, the kind of denial. It's like the 5 stages of grief. They feel angry, then they feel relief. And then they're back in a position of questioning and thinking, if the reality isn't exactly what I thought it was, then what is the reality? And moreover, how can we help more people have a clearer sense of reality? Because what is the harm that's actually done by having these unreal views of myself and other people. But as much as, like you said, right, like it's not just a question of logic, it's not just a question of objectivity looking at data, because the data is already subjective because of how we collect the data, racializing it in the first place, right? And then that gives us a skewed sense of what social justice is. So, is justice so-called white people getting shot at exactly the same rate by law enforcement as so-called black people? Is that justice? Because I would contend that's a skewed sense of justice, right?
You're at least somewhat humanity centered, you know?
That's right. Barbara Fields and Adam Roth wrote a piece on Hannah Pfizer exploring that same line of inquiry. Like, what is social justice? Racial justice is an oxymoron, as my dear friend Carlos Hoyt says, right? Because wherever race is imagined and practiced is to the end of upholding the hierarchies that a lot of self proclaimed DEI practitioners, self-proclaimed anti-racist, what they're saying they want to contend with. And
Right.
that's what makes it a harder conversation, because there are very well-intended folks. At the same time, I would like to point out it's nobody's fault really. We're in this quagmire because this is the quagmire that we've inherited.
Mhm.
We are confronted with it and socialized into it from the outset, from religious institutions, from media, from education, from our government. And it's really hard to find oneself, especially without tools, just outside of it. The fact that I find myself outside of it is nothing short of a miracle.
It's difficult. I live in Switzerland now, right? And so the dynamic of race, I'm in a relationship where my wife would be racialized as white, right? She grew up as a child of Spanish immigrants in Switzerland, and her name is Martina and not Martine, right? So even just having a Spanish spelling of her name in a French speaking part was the difficulty. Now, some people would just deny that, but it doesn't mean that kids weren't equally challenging to her and mean to her as a result of it, and how she could fit in and feel like she belonged given that reality, even though she spoke the language and everything. It's a fascinating conversation that racialization plays its role in a lot of different ways and elevates itself in ways that are at best unhelpful. So I want to move to a little bit about the next another quote from the book that I thought was really important before we move towards talking about what's the path forward and hearing about the togetherness wayfinder. There was a quote in the book that there's no dispensing with identities, but we need to understand them better if we can hope to reconfigure them and free ourselves from mistakes about them that are often a couple of 100 years old. You just talked about that to an extent. Much of what is dangerous about them has to do with the way identities, religion, nation, race, class, culture divide us and set us against one another. Yet, these errors are also central to the way identities unite us today. We need to reform them because, at their best, they make it possible for groups, large and small, to do things together. They are the lies that bind. Can you talk about that particular quote a little bit? Because I want it to lead us into the notion of rememory as you talk about it. So, can you talk a little bit about that and maybe go into a little bit about the togetherness wayfinder alongside of talking about rememory? That's a lot for the audience. Sheena, you can take it step by step because I just threw it all out there because I'm still too excited.
I appreciate the enthusiasm. So, yeah, what you quoted is by philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah from his book, The House of My Father, My Father's House, probably. It's from one of, or no, it's from Lies, The Lies That Bind,
Yeah.
actually, his more recent book on identity. And there's a lot to be said about the merits of his argument. I interpret what he's communicating as saying, although we have we make plenty of errors as it pertains to how we relate to people and how we don't relate to other people, because there are some benefits in how we bind ourselves through these lies. We should just reform how we think of identity and how we do this kind of coalescing around identities. I disagree wholeheartedly with something that I've been doing increasingly in my own classrooms is helping students walk through the process of questioning identity from a
Mm,
very broad perspective of asking, how do you define identity, right? Like, define that for me. And usually they'll say things along the lines of, it's who we are, right? Or it's who I am. And then I'll ask them, okay, now be more specific, right? Like, what comprises our identities? And I get everything from a range of religion to the kind of music I like, to the kind of food that I eat, to who my parents are, to the tried and true categories which Appia is referencing here when he's talking about class, gender,
mhm,
color,
mhm,
creed, etc., race, right? So I'll get the kind of range, and then I'll ask students to hone in on those specific categories that, again, we are socialized to attach to our identities. And I ask them questions. The book as a whole is an invitation to really do a deep dive into how one thinks for themselves about their own identities and their own blind spots, etc. How is it that something like race or something like class, the categories that get assigned to us that are accidental in the sense of, like, it depends on where we're born, what time we're born
mhm,
into, the context in which we live. How is it that race is supposed to be part of our identities, an essential part of identities, an inherent part of our identities, right? An unchangeable part of our identities. How is that? Where does that come from? How did that start? When did that start? Why did that start? And then we go down the path of human history, which of course you can only do so much in a semester, but we delve into it, right? Because if it's an inherent part, an essential part of any of us and our identities, then that's what makes the thing that much harder to question for
mm,
most people, right? For myself, you mentioned Lord of the Rings earlier, which is great because I often describe it as, I felt like I was Smeagol, just like in the mirror arguing with myself as I was going along the path and journey of indeed questioning my identity, questioning what I understood was part of my identity, and also coming up against what my brain was showing me
mhm,
after roughly 20, well, now it's 20, then about 15 years of studying race and racism. I didn't necessarily understand on a heart and a spiritual level what my brain was showing me, which is that to undo racism, we have to undo race. I felt like I was arguing with myself, and I will walk students and invite them along the same path, right? And on a fundamental level, as specific as race is, because of the fact that we're taught to conflate virtually everything under the sun with the category of race and the language of it, right? Remember that Scooby Doo analogy. Questioning identity is really what's at the center of this togetherness wayfinder in the book as a whole, right? It's like every single one of us has misconceptions, has lies that we have inherited, that we have been taught, and therefore we learn and accept as it pertains to who we are, how we are, and who we are in relation with other people. Instead of reform it and end there, which is what I take Appia's position to be, my contention is that we have to do reconstructive work. Yes, we do have to reform how we think about identity indeed, but the primary objective is to get to a place of abolition as it pertains to this category of race. Because what we have done, in fact, all we have done over the centuries as it pertains to this category of race and the problem of race/ism, is reform and reconstruct it. Earlier, you asked a question that made me think initially of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, right? Pick any abolitionists against enslavement in the United States. Their project was one of reconstruction. It was a project of reconstructing race. They understood that to be classified as Black at that time meant to be classified as chattel, to be classified as property, as rightly subjugated and dehumanized. The abolitionist project took the mantle of race and the language of it and try to write humanity into it. I am a Black man, says Frederick Douglass, and I am a man, right? Like emphasis on man. Sojourner Truth. Aren't I
Mhm.
a woman? She has to assert her humanity because she recognizes, even if subconsciously, that to be racialized in the manner that she was to not make her woman, right? Which is a distinctly human category. And so that project of trying to reconstruct race to put humanity into it is a failed project, at
Mm.
least in as far as getting us across the finish line. And it is not accidental that Black Lives Matter has to assert, or anti-racists have to assert
Yeah.
things like, I'm Black and I'm human,
Yep.
or Black Lives Matter. Is because the very category was conceived, created, and practiced within the context of dehumanization. It's high time that we recognize that we cannot reconstruct a category that wasn't meant to humanize to do the humanizing thing, right? Like we cannot do it. We have tried to do that for centuries. It's taken us as far as it can. It's not that there's no progress. Chattel slavery, fortunately, is not happening. Jim Crow is not happening. But we still have not achieved the ideals of America. We haven't achieved the ideas of America and American society. And as you rightly point out, in other countries where racialization exists and where it happens and how it happens, it's still always a dehumanizing project. It's time to recognize that, call it what it is, and create a different pathway.
So on that note, because I want you to end with the togetherness wayfinder, what's the pivot? This feels challenging, Sheena. I've read the book, so I kind of have a little bit of foresight or hindsight, however you take it. But what does it mean? Because this is a mind-blowing idea for a lot of people. Like they love being Black. I think you ever heard that Upton Sinclair quote. He says that it's hard to make a man understand something that his paycheck depends on him not understanding. And so I see a new book, somebody that I know very well just wrote about the battle for the Black mind. Stuff like that is starting to come up. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what a Black mind is, first of all. And two, like that construct, people make their whole mark on the world with the construct. How do you pivot from that, which people feel talking about it benefits them? What sincerely they do. But how can we move to a different conversation?
Omri, have to center and include whiteness in this conversation, right? People hear me engage with my work and recognize that I center Blackness in my book, right? I came to develop the Togetherness Wayfinder largely because I centered what people call Blackness, cultural Blackness, ethnic Blackness, all of the things, right? Like I centered that. That's where my inspiration, my creativity, my imagination, all of that derives from, right? And I don't see that as a racial thing.
Mhm.
See that as a cultural, ethnic, all of the things thing, right? And it's paradoxical to me because in my own centering of blackness, this thing called blackness, I think people fall into the trap of race/ism by centering so-called Black people in conversations about change moving forward. And at the end of the day, I love being Black because I put everything I love about myself into the category. And while I saw that as something racial indeed, I also saw that as a prism to expansiveness, to infinite possibilities. And so the conversation, if we're focusing it on so-called Black people and trying to get Black people to think right about this thing, I feel like we're missing the fact that so-called white people love being white. They love being white too. And just because their racialization is less visible, just because their racialization is less obviously a part of the machinery of race/ism, we are in a time in 2025 in the US where, uh, listen, we need to talk about whiteness. We do. And while I agree that some of my contemporaries approach talking about it in a way that is not received well, that is not effective, largely because it's not supposed to be effective, the togetherness wayfinder, make no mistake, I'm calling for the abolition of this category of whiteness first and
Mm.
foremost, right? Because the non-human category doesn't exist without the human
Right,
category.
right,
So Omri, we have to talk about that, and we have to focus on, in the United States, the people that hold the most literal, like, political, economic power, etc., are not people who get racialized as Black. We're
right,
just not. We're the statistical minority, and we do not have that much power. The people who get power, like, I think you mentioned Ibram X. Kendi. If you didn't, I'll mention him. The people who get power, like Ibram X. Kendi, it's almost and always because of the fact that the people who benefit from the status quo recognize that there's safety to a Kendian position and philosophy. There's safety to a Kendian anti-racism, right? Because it's not calling for the abolition of all of it. It's just not, right? And so, in maintaining how people reconstruct and reform the construction of racism in the first place, we can give all the money to the Kennedys of the world. We can give all the money to whoever else profits from it, no matter their racialization, because at the end of the day, they're not fundamentally calling for the disruption and dismantling of the thing. And is it intentionally? Are they intentionally not calling for the dismantling of it? I would say 9 times out of 10, no. I didn't even discover race abolitionism until it was almost by accident. People just don't know that there's a different way, this other way. They think it's color blindness or it's that, right? And I'm over here waving my hands, see me, you know, see me signing furiously to the blind, where we're all complicit, where we're all accountable, where we're all maintaining the system, the status quo. People who want to hear me are going to hear me. People who want to hear you and your invitation to read this book, they're going to hear it. And those that don't, won't. And that's okay. But this is not about, to my mind, this is not a project of let's fix how so called Black people think, right? I came to my thinking because I studied primarily people who get racialized as Black, period. And whiteness is the invisible elephant in the room, if you will. And that pivot has to happen. But the most effective way we can do that is through the tenets of the wayfinder, the language of the wayfinder, right? How do you help more people see something that's supposed to be invisible, like whiteness? How can you help them see it in a way that doesn't naturalize the category, doesn't trick them into thinking this is a part of who you are, this is your essence, and it has to be, right? There's nothing positive or beneficial about the category and practice of race. Nothing. And the sooner we can help more people recognize that for what it is, the sooner we can help people want to get outside of it. And the wayfinder is a linguistic way to do it, is a philosophical way to do it, it's a informational way to do it. We're not skipping to the good part. We're not saying, hey, just stop talking about race. That's not it. All I do is talk about race, Omri. That's all I do. So it's not any of that. This is something that we have truly never tried in American society, probably any
Yeah,
society, if
yeah.
we're being honest. Um, and also for you in Switzerland, right? Like, though I'm very American centric because I'm American and I live in the United States, the Wayfinder as a framework has universal
I,
application. The information changes, the history changes, the language changes. And that's the work that folks not in the United States can get from this Wayfinder approach. You take the framework and see how it plays out in your own context.
so Sheena, I have so much based on what you just said, and we're going to close out. I'm going to talk to you about it offline, and then I'm probably just going to have you come back. So, you are the mother of triplets. I have a 6-year old that was born here in Switzerland. His primary language is Swiss German. He speaks other languages. He speaks French. He speaks some Spanish. He speaks English, obviously. I think he speaks English most of the time, but to his daddy, because he doesn't understand much German. But we've been very deliberate about not moving him into this racial category. So when you think of a world of racelessness in your mind's eye, what's the world like for your triplets, for my son, if we move into this new possibility?
I love that question. Thank you so much for that. To my mind, racelessness is synonymous with limitlessness. And there are two ways that limits get placed onto us. We internalize limits and then place limitations on ourselves. And then there's the external that happens in order for us to internalize the limitations, right? There are external factors that also try to put limitations on us. When I imagine a future without race slash ism, I imagine a future where there are no longer external limitations placed on any of us, at least not based on the project of race slash ism, right? Like, I am not naive. I understand that there are many other ways that we create and maintain hierarchies. And I see all of those hierarchies as thoroughly pernicious. But just focusing on racism, if we successfully abolish racism, there will not be limits placed on people through the practice of racialization and the belief in race. Like, we just would not be doing that anymore. It would become archaic. Somebody called me once, and I've held on to this. Somebody called me once the Galileo of race. And it encouraged me to revisit the history of like Galileo, also Copernicus, right? Like people who were treated like lepers because during their lifetimes, the actual scientific reality, right? The earth being a globe and the earth not being the center of the universe, it was considered blasphemy. People didn't want to hear it, right? They really wanted to hold on to this idea that like
Mm,
we're the center of the universe and also the earth is flat, right? They just really want to hold on. We have a flat earth society, so there are still people who hold on to that idea,
sure.
right? But I imagine with this analogy that in the future, the flat earth society, we will have that very small percentage of people who are just like, you know what? I'm holding on to race. I'm white. You're black, we're mixed, whatever, right? Like, they're just holding on to it. They won't let it go. I imagine that there will be a time where a small percentage of people are just really holding on to it. Probably neo Nazis. I'm just guessing, right? But then the rest of us, we gonna be out here living our best, free from racism lives. We're not gonna be dehumanizing each other. We're not going to look at each other as less than, right? We're not going to be racializing everything under the sun, thereby putting limits on it. That's the future that keeps me smiling, that keeps me going, that keeps me fighting against all of the currents, because there are plenty of currents. 99% of people do not want to hear my ideas or my messaging, right? Because for all the reasons we've discussed, it's hard out here,
Yeah.
right? It's hard. It's hard to argue with yourself. I get it. But that future is totally possible. And I want that for your kids. I want that for mine. I want that for our grandchildren if we have them, and everyone listening. Like, I want that sincerely. And we can have it, we can create it. And it starts now, it starts today, and it starts with us. It's not about trying to fix how so called Black people think, right? Because I didn't create the problem of racism, right? Let's start there. And at the same time, internalizing the reality of race slash ism does put unnecessary constraints on me, right? It does make me police myself in ways that I could free myself from. It has physical impacts on me. And if you look at the number one killer of African American women, right, it's like heart disease and heart problems and stuff like that. It has a physical impact on me. And yet it doesn't have to. And
Mhm.
my head isn't in the clouds. I'm not unaware of how some people look at me, what they might think about me, right? I'm not unaware. I'm hyper aware, if anything. It's just that I've had to rewire my brain in a way that actually benefits me and that will benefit my children.
Yeah.
That's the aspiration. Is it hard? Yeah, but marathons are hard. People do marathons all the time. Not a lot of people, but plenty of people do marathons all the time. We do hard things all the time.
Yep.
Like, something being hard shouldn't be a deterrent, especially if it's the morally correct thing to do. So, sure, it's hard, but the rewards of it. I used to be a bodybuilder. The rewards of bodybuilding, getting on that stage, I mean, come on. There's nothing better to it. Being a parent is hard.
That's beautiful, Sheena. And thank you for taking the time with us today. I definitely want to bring you back because I think there's so many other angles that we can go down. But this was absolutely beautiful. I am sure it was helpful to the audience. And I look forward to sharing this episode. If you're listening, give it a like or follow Sheena where you can follow her. And we'll have that in the show notes. And please, please, please pick up The Raceless, Anti-Racist. Dr. Sheena Mason, thank you.
Thank you, Omri. I appreciate you. I'm coming back.
All right. Make it a great day, folks. Peace. If you are committed or simply a little bit curious about how to make DEI accessible to everyone, actionable, that is, unambiguously prioritized and sustainable, aligned with personal and organizational purpose, hit the subscribe button. Make it a great day. Peace.